Across Saskatchewan, many towns began the same way, with open prairie, a rail line, a siding, a few settlers, and the belief that something lasting could be built. Some towns became busy centers, some faded with time, while others still carry the marks of their beginning. This is the journey through 10 Saskatchewan towns, and the stories behind how they began. And like so many prairie stories, it begins with land, steel, and people who are willing to take a chance. Before Avonlea was a village, before the rails arrived, this was simply open prairie, a place that had not yet been named. And when the name finally came, it brought a bit of mystery with it. No one seems to know for certain where the name Avonlea came from. At least, I could not find hard documented proof. Some believe it may have been inspired by the book, Anne of Avonlea, published in 1909. Others point to older language roots, Avon, from the Welsh Afon, meaning river, and Lea, from Old English Lea, meaning meadow or clearing. But that explains the wording, not necessarily the naming. Some say a railwayman named it. Others suggest it may have been borrowed from the river Avon in England, possibly by early officials like Thomas Clay. Whatever the truth, Avonlea it is. Okay, let's step back, because the story of Avonlea doesn't actually begin with the town itself, but with the settlement of the district in the early years leading up to its birth. To understand how the village eventually took root, we first have to go back to the turn of the century, when the open range began to give way to the first homesteads. In the early 1880s, this was still ranch country. Among the earliest to arrive were the Mowat brothers, Daniel, Alex, and Sidney. They established a large horse ranch along Long Creek, about 2 miles from where this village would later stand. At its peak, the ranch held nearly 2,000 horses. There were no roads, there wasn't a town, and there was no railway. During those years, Mowat's Ranch became one of the only places travelers could stop between Regina and the southern outposts, like Wood Mountain. Soon other ranchers followed, the Hewitsons, the Rennie brothers, Herb Sanderson, and others, because in the early years horses mattered more than cattle. It was still a land of movement. By 1902, homesteaders like William Miller and the Leipert family began breaking the land. And in 1903, the first real settlement formed in what would become known as the New Warren District. They came from far away, places like Ontario, the Maritimes, the United States, England, and Europe. Now, a good portion of these new settlers arrived through Rollo. Then they followed the Old Wood Mountain Trail, a worn route cutting through the prairie near the future town site of Avonlea. And along that trail, they chose their land. With that growth came the first center. In 1906, W.L. McRory built a store and a post office about 2 miles north of the village. It was called New Warren, named by settlers from Minnesota. For a time, that small place served the entire district. Then the railway arrived. On August 24, 1911, the first Canadian Northern train reached this community. After years of isolation, the district was finally connected. Now, in true Prairie fashion, as the train approached, a 13-year-old boy spotted it in the distance. He jumped on his pony and rode in to meet it, catching it near the water tank. He then escorted it the rest of the way in. Within 2 years, he was working at the station. That's how quickly things changed. Almost overnight, New Warren faded and everything shifted toward the tracks at Avonlea. Avonlea was incorporated on February 10, 1912. The first council met in the office of Thomas Clay, who served as the village's first secretary-treasurer. Focusing on the basics: water, lighting, sidewalks, fire protection, and law enforcement. Now, to fund it, the village secured a $2,500 loan. Soon after, town began to grow, and it grew fast. Lumber yards were among the first businesses, supplying materials for the buildings going up around them. Coal and wood yards followed, providing fuel for homes, businesses, and the railway. In 1912, a 3-story hotel opened on Main Street. Restaurants soon followed. Charlie Yee ran one beside the hotel. After it burned in 1916, he rebuilt and continued there for decades. General stores quickly popped up. McRory built one with a post office inside, and Alex Eason opened another. The street quickly filled in: harness shops, pool rooms, barber shops, bakeries, butcher shops, hardware stores, and implement dealers. Everything a prairie town needed, all within a few blocks. And just beyond the town, another industry was taking shape. In the hills near Avonlea, rich deposits of clay were discovered, and from those deposits, brickmaking began. At Claybank, one of the most significant brick plants in Western Canada would be established. The clay found in this region proved to be of exponential quality. These bricks were shipped across the prairies and used in buildings far beyond this small community. For a time, Avonlea was not just a farming center, but part of a much larger industrial story, and the railway made it possible. Without the railroad, the clay stayed in the ground. With it, its reach was unlimited. Grain elevators soon followed. By 1913, they were already rising above the prairie. The province elevator, the cooperative, the federal, the southern. They defined the skyline and had purpose in this town. The railway changed everything. Before the rail depot arrived, farmers had to haul their grain to Rollo. It took a full day there and back. Now, they have their own town. It opened this community to the wider world. You could travel to Moose Jaw in the morning and return that very day. Freight arrived by rail. Cattle were loaded here and shipped to new markets. And town supplies were all handled through this station. The station became the center of life, and like any prairie town, Avonlea had its stories. One story tells of a barrel of whiskey sitting on the platform, bound for another town. A few locals quietly bored into it and drained it off. When the train crew later tried to load it, the empty barrel told the story. And as all this was happening, at the same time, town was organizing itself. Dr. A.W. Dunnett was appointed as the medical officer, providing care to the growing community. A fire hall and a jail were built, and a volunteer fire brigade was formed to protect the new town. The village purchased chemical fire engines and a fire bell, preparing for the risks that came with wooden buildings and rapid growth. The council's minutes for those early years reveal interesting details about life during that time. Horse racing was banned on the streets. Hitching posts were being debated. Pool rooms were restricted for the young people. Dog licenses were issued. Even the waterman was reprimanded for using the town's team for long Sunday drives. It was a town learning how to function. And here's something we can all relate to. In 1918, influenza reached the town. Like communities across the prairies, Avonlea was forced to respond. Masks were required, gatherings were restricted, and public places were closed. Life, which had been moving so quickly, slowed almost overnight, but the town endured. In the years that followed, the village stabilized. Land was annexed. The curling rink was built in 1925 and electricity arrived in 1926. Gradually, the town moved from rapid growth into something more settled. By the late 1920s and 30s, Avonlea was well on its way. Main Street had wooden sidewalks, and like most prairie towns, the railway station stood at the end of it. At the station, telegraph keys clicked behind the counter, while teams of horses and their owners pulled up to unload freight. And during the winter, the waiting room carried the smell of coal smoke. And like all prairie towns, it kept changing. Wooden sidewalks were replaced with concrete, and the streets were gradually improved as well, graveled and lit as the village modernized. By 1961, natural gas had arrived, and in 1962, a water treatment plant and a full system brought running water into every home, a far step from the days of wagons and water tanks moving through the streets. What had begun in those early years slowly became something modern, but the foundation of Avonlea has not changed. Avonlea was built first by ranchers, then by homesteaders, then shaped by the railway. It grew because people needed a place closer than the next town, a place to trade, ship grain, buy supplies, and connect to the wider world. And over time it became exactly that. A prairie town under the edge of the hills, a main street that ended at the station, a place built by people who arrived with very little and made something lasting. And whatever the name originally meant, this place gave it meaning. The highway stretches forward in a straight, patient line as mile after mile of open prairie unfolds. Even with the fields lying empty, the sheer scale of the landscape, it's impossible to miss. For those who came here in the early 1900s, the vastness wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. This landscape promised room to work, room to start over. That message traveled far beyond the prairie itself. Across eastern Canada, especially Ontario, printed flyers and notices called for labor in the West. Some were blunt. 40,000 men needed to build railways, needed to harvest crops, needed to turn open land into production. Many answered the call. They arrived by train, often intending to stay only one season. Some returned east, others did not. For those who remained, the distance they crossed became something permanent. Land measured not just in acres, but in effort. At the same time, rail lines were still being pushed west. Those rails carried more than people and supplies. They carried expectations and assumptions, ideas about how towns should form and who it was meant to serve. For now, what matters is how this place began. At a moment when land was being claimed quickly, labor was urgently needed, and the sheer scale of the prairie made it possible to believe that almost anything could take root here. When Saskatchewan became a province in 1905, federal policy turned decisively towards settlement. The Prairie West was promoted aggressively as a place of opportunity. Immigration literature circulated across eastern Canada, the United States, Great Britain, and Europe, promising land ownership and a future built through hard work. For a fee of $10, a settler could claim a quarter section. This amounted to 160 acres. By agreeing to live on the land for 6 months each year over 3 years and making improvements, a second quarter section could be purchased as well, paid over 5 years with interest. Before there was a town site, settlement in the district had already begun. By 1908, homesteads were already scattered across the surrounding countryside, even though there was no post office and no permanent depot. Housing was equally improvised. Some families lived in tents through the summer of 1908. One woman, sitting behind her tent, asked where the town was going to be. Her husband pointed toward a lone boxcar on the prairie and said, "Right down there." At that point, this place still existed more as an idea than a location. The rail arrived in this district early, but it was the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway that shaped this place. The line arrived in 1908, and by 1910, the GTP had established a divisional point here, building a large station and a roundhouse. That investment anchored the settlement as a working rail center rather than a simple stop along the line. The Grand Trunk Pacific was absorbed into Canadian National Railways in the early 1920s, part of a broader national consolidation of rail systems. The Canadian Pacific Railway had also passed through the district earlier in 1907, but it was the GTP's infrastructure that defined the town's early role. The focus was on essentials, getting roads built and surveying the land. By the 1911 census, the population had climbed into the several hundreds, reflecting rapid growth tied directly to rail access and surrounding homesteads. In 1911, Biggar was incorporated as a town. Water quickly became the town's first major challenge. Wells were drilled across the area without success. Until a reliable source finally was located. Once that was secured, growth accelerated. Streets were graded, sidewalks were laid, electrical lighting followed soon after. By 1913, the Grand Trunk Pacific completed stockyards near the elevator, reinforcing the town's role as a regional agricultural hub. Grain and livestock from the surrounding district flowed through here, tying local farms directly to national markets. By 1914, the town had captured national attention. Its population tripled in just over 2 years, moving Biggar past its frontier beginnings and into a period of permanent stability. As businesses multiplied and residential neighborhoods expanded outward from the rail lines, local services grew rapidly to keep pace with the thriving community. The railway remained the heartbeat of daily life. The opening of a local telegraph office brought a new level of convenience, ending the need for long trips to neighboring stations. Meanwhile, townsite's land was surveyed and marketed with high energy. Real estate was promoted across Saskatchewan and as far away as Chicago, with every advertisement highlighting the area's fertile soil and prime rail access. The 1920s arrived with a mix of big dreams and growing pains. Out in the fields, the roar of the tractor was beginning to drown out the sound of the horses. As machines quickly evolved, they made the work faster and more efficient than ever before. But the progress came at a price. While technology moved forward, markets shifted and debt began to pile up on many Saskatchewan doorsteps. New faces were arriving as well, bringing rapid change to the local culture. By 1921, the population had leveled off at about 1,000 people. The town had finally found its size, even if it hadn't quite figured out where it was heading next. In the late 1920s, Biggar stood at a cultural crossroads. Rapid growth had brought new immigrants and new tensions to the province, providing an opening for the clan to establish a significant presence in Saskatchewan. Promoting good citizenship and loyalty to the Crown, the clan established more than 100 branches across the province. Biggar was part of this wave. Local halls hosted well-attended public lectures by J.J. Maloney and other organizers, reflecting a province-wide debate over Saskatchewan's culture and religious future. However, the movement's presence was far from a consensus. Many local leaders, including members of the clergy, journalists, and civic figures, spoke out publicly against the clan's message, rejecting its divisive rhetoric in favor of community stability. The movement's political peak in 1929 helped usher in a new provincial government, but its influence proved fragile. With the onset of the Great Depression, the clan's membership collapsed as families shifted their focus towards collective survival. While this period does not define Biggar's entire story, it remains an essential part of the historical record, a testament to the complexities and tensions of the Prairie's early social fabric. The 1930s arrived like a thief, stealing the prosperity of the prairies. In Biggar, the sky turned black, not with rain but with suffocating dust of the dirty 30s. Families watched as crop prices bottomed out and the local economy froze. While some packed their lives into wagons to leave, those who stayed found strength in mutual aid and cooperation. They did not survive through growth, but through stubborn persistence that held the community together until the winds finally changed. The drums of World War II signaled a rebirth. Suddenly the world was hungry for Saskatchewan grain once again, and the markets, they stabilized. After 1945, the dust settled into a solid foundation for steady growth. Biggar didn't chase the dreams of becoming a sprawling metropolis. Instead, it perfected its role as a dependable service hub. The railroad tracks, now part of the massive Canadian national system, transitioned from carrying hopeful pioneers to hauling the massive freight that would define the town for decades to come. This video only represents a glimpse into this community's early history, representing only a fraction of its total timeline. There is far more to tell, far more to share, and far more to explore than can ever fit into a single video. Long before the rails were laid with purpose, this land was home and a crossing point for First Nations people, as well as the Métis. Their history is the first of many layers here. The story of this place unfolds slowly. It's shaped by land worked season after season, and by the people who stayed long enough for something lasting to take hold. In the late 1880s, the Canadian prairies weren't exactly a destination. To the government in Ottawa, this vast stretch of land between Regina and Prince Albert was a problem to be solved, a forbidding gap that needed a bridge, and that bridge was the railroad. In 1887, the Canadian government authorized a massive land grant for the Qu'Appelle Long Lake Railway and Steamboat Company. The deal was simple. The railway built the tracks, and in return, it received land. But there was a catch. The land had to be suitable for settlement. In other words, it had to be land that people could actually farm, live on, and turn into communities. Construction began quickly. Subcontractors like Donald Mann, a name that would later become legendary in Canadian rail, pushed the line north. By 1887, it reached Bethune. By 1889, it hit Hanley, and on May 11, 1890, the first train arrived in Saskatoon. For the first decade, this region wasn't really a home. For most people, it was only a view through a train window. 3 trains a week rattled across the rails, and between Lumsden and Dundurn, there was no station, no operator, and almost no sign that a town would ever rise here. Each year, prairie fires swept over the open country, leaving the land blackened and bare. To anyone passing through, it did not look like the beginning of farms and communities. It looked empty. It looked exposed. It looked like a place the railway crossed, not a place people were rushing to settle. And for the investors, the line was a disaster. Service was irregular. Development was sparse. Profits did not exist. The land they had been given was supposed to be their reward. Instead, it was starting to look more like a liability. Yes, the rails had been laid across the prairie, but for a time, it seemed like a bridge to nowhere. By 1896, the CPR had stepped in to lease the line, but that did not solve the deeper problem. The railway still crossed a region many people doubted. The QLL and S still had land connected to the line, but not enough settlers were coming in to purchase. Yes, there were rails on the ground, but not enough traffic. It was a railway route across the prairie, but not yet a corridor that could pay for itself. Shortly after 1900, the QLL and S took legal action against the Canadian government, arguing that the land it had received was not fit for farming as promised. The land battle caught the attention of Clifford Sifton, the Minister of the Interior. He wanted the West settled and understood the dangers. If the land was publicly dismissed as useless, settlement could slow, investors could lose confidence, and the dream of filling the West could become much harder. So he sent his Dominion Colonization Commissioner, C.W. Spears, to find someone with enough capital, with enough nerve, to prove the land had value. Spears contacted Amos Warner, a wealthy businessman from Minneapolis, who helped connect him with Colonel Davidson and A.D. McCrae. And soon after, Davidson, McCrae, and several others formed the Saskatchewan Valley Land Company. They made a daring bet. They bought 500,000 acres from the government for $1 an acre, and another 1.25 million acres from the railway company. And now came the real challenge. They had to sell it. So the new company launched an extensive advertising campaign aimed at land seekers in the American Midwest. They arranged an excursion train. And this was not some rough little prairie trip. The train was stocked with eatables and drinkables. It had sleeping cars, dining cars, and coaches. The train moved slowly over the hastily repaired tracks between Regina and Prince Albert. Along the way, passengers stepped off to see the countryside for themselves. They could look at the soil. They could stand on the land. They could imagine farms where there were none yet. That was the whole point. And the plan, well, it worked better than anyone expected. The trip was declared a success and led to what some historians call a massive land-buying orgy. As excitement spread through the American Midwest, thousands of acres began changing hands. So now the original owners of the QLL and S realized the line had become more valuable than it had once been in its struggling early years. They informed the CPR that the lease would not be renewed past the fall of 1906. And at the same time, Sir William Mackenzie and Sir Donald Mann, who had helped build the line as subcontractors, saw its value for their expanding Canadian Northern Railway. James J. Hill's Great Northern Railway was also interested. But after a brief bidding contest, Mackenzie and Mann won. In March of 1906, the Canadian Northern Railway acquired the QLL and S. With settlers arriving in growing numbers, the little stop on the line finally had a future. In 1903, Craik was officially incorporated as a village with a modest population of 106 people. In those early years, things were primitive. If you wanted your mail, for example, you didn't go to a proper post office building. You went down to the station platform and looked for a large box. You sorted through the pile yourself and took what was yours. It was simple, it was practical, and it tells you just how young this place still was. The post office was officially established in 1903. It was located in the general store. This was a common practice of the time. And by 1907, the population had grown to 326. That was enough for the village to apply for town status, and Craik was incorporated as a town that same year. The first town council meeting was held on August 29, 1907. One of the early orders of business was looking into constructing a building that could serve several purposes at once. In September of 1907, E.A. Phipps was asked to submit plans and costs for a building suitable for a jail, a fire hall, and a council chambers. That one detail says a lot about early prairie towns. The government, fire protection, and law enforcement could all fit under one roof because the community itself was still being built from the ground up. In just a few years, it had gone from a small railway place with a mailbox on a station platform to a village, and then a town with council, bylaws, and a post office, and plans for a jail, fire hall, and council chamber. The railroad had brought the opportunity, but now the people had to build the town. For a railroad, two things mattered more than anything else: water and coal. Without them, steam engines died, and this place, well, it had both. The water tower became a landmark, standing north of the station, and in 1901, the CPR built a dam north of Craik to obtain a water supply. It wasn't easy work. The first dam washed out the very next spring and had to be rebuilt again in 1902. In the following year, 1903, a pipeline had been laid from the dam to the railway water tower, with the original water tank holding 40,000 gallons. Every train that rolled through had to pause here for a service stop, which took about an hour as crews wheeled out coal and pumped water into the train's holding tank. This gave passengers an opportunity to stretch their legs and look around, a welcoming pause in their long journey. Eventually, a man named G.P. Newlove, who had come with the railway crew, remained here and took charge of the pumping station. He held that position until retirement, and then his son George took over the station. That kind of detail matters, because it shows that the railway did not just pass through here. It created work. It created responsibility. It created families whose lives were tied directly to the machinery on the line. However, the real engine room of the town was the coal dock. It was located on the northwest edge of town, on the west side of the railway tracks. It was the only coal dock on the railway line between Regina and Saskatoon. Now, this wasn't just a pile of coal. It was an industrial structure, a large overhead gravity bin with elevating equipment used to lift coal into place. Typically, there were 2 shifts daily, with up to 3 men per shift. Their one responsibility: keep the coal flowing. In the winter, the job became even harder. Some of the coal came from Alberta. Some came from the eastern United States. Sometimes the American coal arrived frozen. In the cold weather, the coal in the overhead bin could freeze as well. When that happened, one of the workers would have to climb up and break it loose with large bars. One local story tells of a worker named Harry Barnett. While he was breaking up the coal so that it could run freely, he slipped in the bin. And before he knew what was happening, he came out an open coal chute and landed directly into the coal tender of a waiting train. This is the kind of story that makes railway history feel human, and it proved that this was not just a town beside the tracks. It was places like this that kept the railway alive. As town grew, so did the luxuries. In 1909, long-distance telephone service had arrived. Now, that may sound small today, but at the time, it was a milestone. For a community that had begun with mail sorted out of a box at the station platform, the telephone was a new kind of connection. The railway could move people and freight. The post office could move letters. And now voice could travel anywhere. By 1914, town even had its own cinema, the Rex Theatre. Even the sidewalks were a sign of progress. They started out as 8-foot wide wooden boards in 1905, but by the late 1920s, the town was beginning to transition to concrete. That shift may seem ordinary, but it says something important. Wooden sidewalks belong to a rougher first stage of settlement. Moving to concrete meant the town was expected to last. The railway had made town possible, but it was not perfect. It could still be late, it could still break down, it could still leave people waiting. And yet, despite it all, town kept growing into a fuller community. It had telephones, it had sidewalks, it had a theater, it had fire protection, council chambers, a post office, and businesses. The town was no longer just a place where engines stopped for water and coal. It had now become a place where people built ordinary lives around the rhythm of the trains. The population of the community flowed with the fortunes of the province. From 106 people in 1903, the town grew steadily, reaching its peak in 1956 with 607 residents. But as the world changed, the technology that had built the town began to fade. By the early 1950s, the age of the coal-fired steam engine was coming to an end. The Great Coal Dock, one of the most important working points on the line, fell silent and was demolished in 1959. Then there was the water tower. Well, it lasted a little longer, but its railway purpose ended in 1958, when the rail company converted to diesel power. The great symbols of the railway age are gone now. The coal dock was dismantled. The water tower, it no longer stands here. The steam engines, well, they fell silent. We need to thank this community for the memories. As you travel south from Avonlea along Highway 334, the sense of seclusion is unmistakable. In this sparsely populated part of the province, it's entirely possible to make the trip without passing a single motorist. It's a landscape of vast rhythmic beauty, where the sky feels heavy and the wind is a constant companion. Eventually, the road brings you to a cluster of structures that seem to rise out of the grass, like ghosts. A couple churches, a few houses, and an aging elevator, and a long row of abandoned buildings. These are the markers of what was once a small but active prairie community. This is Kayville, Saskatchewan. Before this town site existed, the area was just a scattering of individual homesteads. So let's go back a bit. Around 1905, two ranchers, Julius Martin and Billy McKay, were among the first non-Indigenous settlers working the land in this area. They saw the potential in the land long before there was any thought of building a town here. By 1906, the first homesteaders arrived to file land claims. Under the Dominion Land Act, they began building their futures on 160-acre plots of raw prairie. But in those early years, there was no town here yet. And when you needed supplies, you traveled across the open grass, often trekking all the way to Rollo. And it also should be noted that the arrival of families from Romania between 1905 and 1908 shaped this community's identity for generations. In the early 1900s, the Canadian prairie was shrinking as railway lines pushed deeper into the horizon. And in the fall of 1924, the arrival of Truax changed this quiet crossroads forever. The very moment that the CPR extended its tracks westward, the transformation here was almost overnight. As if drawn by a magnet, the open prairie reorganized itself around the new steel siding. Businesses once isolated in the countryside began migrating toward the rails just to survive. Dan Kozak led the charge, physically moving his store from a hill 2 miles away to sit directly beside the tracks. The Security Lumber Company quickly followed, fueling a sudden building boom. Mr. Ritko relocated his pool hall closer to the growing settlement, while Alex Bodnaresk opened a cafe and a hotel for travelers arriving by rail. In a remarkably short time, what had been scattered homesteads was now a functioning village, built, quite literally, along the line of the railway. Soon, this village had all the essentials. A blacksmith shop served the growing farming district. The ring of the hammer and the anvil became a constant soundtrack to town's growth. A hardware store opened around 1925, and a butcher shop operated throughout the early years as well. A livery barn and a dray service operated by George Ursa handled the constant movement of freight from rail cars to local farms. And there's the post office, which actually opened years earlier on October 1st, 1912. It was originally located inside Dan Kozak's store. In 1927, it moved into the hands of Dan and Mary Ritsko, who would operate it for decades, becoming the town's primary link to the outside world. Agriculture quickly became the economic backbone. When the railway arrived in 1924, the Saskatchewan Cooperative Elevator Company immediately began constructing a grain elevator. Shortly afterward, the Star Grain Company built a second. And by 1926, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool had purchased the co-op elevator, marking the start of a 50-year era where two grain companies anchored the town. During the harvest, the elevators stood as towering beacons of prosperity, visible for miles across the flats, as wagons lined beside the tracks to offload the season's haul. And by the late 1920s, Kayville had evolved into a bustling service hub. But Kayville was more than just about grain. During the village's early development, several flour mills were active in the surrounding area, including an early operation run by A.D. Donison, just outside the town site before 1924. Donison was also known as something of a pioneer entertainer. Around 1922, he projected a Charlie Chaplin film onto the interior wall of his mill. This was likely the first motion picture ever seen by residents in the district. Imagine for a moment, it wasn't the scent of popcorn in the air, but the scent of flour. There was the hum of the projector, and a flickering motion picture opening a window to a wider world. By the late 1930s, the cooperative movement had reached the district. In 1937, local farmers formed the Kayville Cooperative Association, first supplying coal and petroleum before expanding into general merchandise. After the Second World War, the co-op grew alongside the community, moving into a larger building in the mid-1940s that served the area for decades. Early on, pool halls and bowling alleys drew people together, and in the winter of 1958-59, one of those buildings was transferred into the first curling rink with 2 sheets of ice. A larger facility soon followed in 1971, built near the former railway station. Modern conveniences arrived slowly. Telephone service did not reach the community until 1946. Local residents had to travel to Regina to request a connection. That same year, a telephone exchange was installed in Kayville. Streetlights were first turned on in 1953. And in 1954, town gathered to watch the community's first television set, installed in the home of Dan Daniel. But there were hardships as well. On the night of September 12, 1950, Kayville experienced the worst fire in its history. Flames swept through the west side of Main Street, destroying an entire block of buildings. The community rebuilt. A new cafe opened that following summer, and in 1951, George Majorin constructed a brick hotel building that included a bar and a cafe. Standing as a provincial heritage site, the St. Peter and Paul Romanian Orthodox Church was established in 1908. Built by settlers from the Bukovina region, it remains a permanent link to the community's cultural roots. To this day, it is one of the oldest and best preserved Romanian Orthodox churches in Western Canada. Built in 1926, the Hope Lutheran Church served the German Lutheran families of the district during town's peak years. A classic white frame Prairie Gothic church with a tall steeple, it has stood silent since the 1960s, yet it still remains a prominent landmark on the horizon. The community served the surrounding farms through the 1950s and 60s, supported by garages, service stations, and implement dealers. The final wheat pool elevator, built in 1973 with a capacity of 50,000 bushels, became the last major grain facility in Kayville. The Prairie was changing. Mechanization reduced rural populations. Service shifted to larger centers, and when the railway was abandoned in 1998, another chapter quietly closed. Today, only a handful of residents remain, yet the past still lingers. Old storefronts, quiet streets, and the silhouette of a grain elevator on the horizon. And one can only be grateful. Thank you, Kayville, for the stories you've left behind. Before the streets, before the buildings, and long before there was a name to pin on a map, there was the rail. In the 1890s, the Sioux Line was a solitary ribbon of steel cutting from the American border to Moose Jaw. For 13 years, this was strictly a transit route, a steel pipeline through an unnamed ocean of grass. You see, trains didn't stop here. They were just passing through, pumping American settlers north and Canadian grain south. And by 1906, the Canadian Pacific Railway was ready to turn this transit route into a series of stops. The CPR's engineers had a logical plan. They had marked a future siding and town site. It was evenly spaced, it was efficient. However, Bernard Larson had different ideas. While this area was still nothing more but wind and grass, this homesteader didn't just farm the prairie, he bought the map. Larson knew the main line was already there, but he wanted the siding moved onto his soil. Through a documented bribe, he forced the CPR to scrap their blueprints and move the planned stop onto his quarter section. And once that second set of tracks was spiked into Larson's dirt, the location, well, it was no longer a debate. Only then did the surveyors arrive. Only then the name Lang appeared on the manifest. Every berth, every business, every brick that followed was tethered to that single manipulated point on the map. The railway was always going to build a town. Larson just ensured they built it on his land, instead of 5 miles down the track. By the spring of 1904, the wild prairie was starting to give way to the grid. Progress was on its way. On May 15th, S.C. Wright opened the first post office, a tiny anchor of permanence in a sea of uncertainty. This site was finally named Lang, a nod to George MacDonald Lang, a senior CPR engineer and architect. This was a standard company move. The railroad didn't just lay the tracks, it owned the map, naming its new assets after the men who drew the blueprints. Next came the elevator. In 1905 it was erected, and it was a signal to the world that the prairie was open for business. It was the single point of contact between the raw work of the field and the global market. It provided the only proof that mattered. If the grain moved, the money followed. Main Street was just a few buildings sitting in the raw prairie grass. There was the post office, Wright's Hardware, and a general store. They stood apart from one another, while the bakery and drugstore nearby were just unfinished frames at the time. Across from them sat the livery and the blacksmith shop and a doctor's tiny office. Past those few final structures, it was back to open prairie. People didn't come to Lang for what it was, they came for what it promised to be. Life around Lang in those early days was a straight-up constant negotiation with the land. Behind every new homestead, there was a structure built for survival. It was the barn. This was the working heart of the family operation. During this time, families relied on the literal muscle of their horses to move everything from water to winter wood. And it was also the children who kept the gears turning. They spent their days hauling coal, chopping wood, and tending to the livestock, often before sitting down to an ungodly amount of school homework. Education itself was a bit of a scramble as well. It was said that at one point, the local kids were moved into a converted barn because the town was growing faster than the schoolhouse could be built. Once a year, the work stopped. education was put aside while town erupted. Because of the mass influx of Americans who settled in the area north of town, caused Lang to skip July 1st. The community threw its energy into July 4th. It was a day of celebration, a high-voltage marathon that went well into the night. Thousands of people from both sides of the border descended on the village for a baseball tournament and to watch the horse races. The air was thick with dust and the booming, gravelly voice of Mr. Stisworth, the official announcer. He was the man with a legendary set of lungs. Locals swore you could hear him call a race from half a mile away. His voice would carry over the roar of the crowd and the thundering hooves on the track. Now for local police, July 4th, well, it was a reoccurring disaster. On this day, the crimes in Lang weren't the works of masterminds. They were the product of 90-degree heat, high-stakes betting, and a surplus of cheap whiskey. By mid-afternoon, the town's small wooden jail was usually packed to the rafters, with men sleeping off their tempers and their losses. On one legendary sports day, the heat in the cells became unbearable. While the rest of town was gathered at the finish line, screaming for their favorite horse, the inmates inside the jail decided they'd had enough. No, they didn't try and pick the locks. Instead, they used the only tool they had left: fire from a lamp. They carefully set the wooden structure ablaze, not to burn it down, but to char the timber until the wood was soft enough to break. As town was distracted by a tense inning at the Ball Diamond and the deafening calls from the announcer, the prisoners watched as the wood blackened. They managed to kick a hole right through the wall, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. One by one, the inmates stepped out of the smoking building and simply vanished into the crowd. By the time the law realized the jail was empty, the criminals were likely blocks away, blending into the spectators or heading out into the tall grass of the prairies. It was a classic piece of frontier logic. When the world is looking at the finish line, you make your exit. The community's greatest enemy wasn't the winter or the work, it was isolation. To fight this, they built their own nervous system. Starting in 1906, they strung telephone lines across the district, connecting lonely farms to a switchboard in the drugstore. It was a crude network, but it killed the silence. For a time, the railroad rewarded their efforts. The community and Lang became the titan of the Sioux Line, boasting the second largest grain handling capacity in the entire province, only eclipsed by Indian Head. The weather and the land was difficult to manage, but it was producing. The population climbed past 300, and the empty gaps on Main Street finally filled with brick and mortar. Horses were replaced by machines. Efficiency rose. It seemed that anything was possible. Then suddenly, almost overnight, the world, well, it changed. The 1930s brought a hard truth. A town built on the railway siding is only as strong as the market and the weather. The Depression slowed the pulse of the village, and later, better roads, faster cars meant people could bypass Lang altogether. And just like many prairie towns in the Depression era, Lang did not die, it just evolved. Water and sewers replaced the barns and the outhouses. The pioneers were replaced by commuters who drove to Regina or Weyburn, returning to the quiet of Lang at the end of the day. Today, the story of Lang isn't just about growth, it's about resilience. And it all started with a single, questionable decision to move a railway siding. From that one choice, an entire history unfolded. Not every building lasted, and not every dream came true. But in a place where the wind is truly trying to blow the dirt away, the measure of success isn't how fast you build, it's how long you endure. It's one of those gray prairie mornings, the kind where the day hasn't quite made up its mind how it's going to look. Now, nothing about today's drive hints at to where the road is leading us, and yet it's taking us toward a place with a connection you wouldn't quite expect. Not of the prairie itself, but to one of the most well-known disasters in modern history, tied not by events, but by a name. You see, this place wasn't named after a head of state, a homesteader, or a local figure. It was named after a railway man, Sir Charles Melville Hayes. He was the president of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, and one of the central figures behind the push west across the prairies. Naming towns after senior railway officials wasn't unusual. It reflected who was making the decisions that determined where the lines ran and where towns would eventually exist. In 1912, while returning from England, Hayes lost his life aboard the Titanic. The railway, well, it carried on. The town, it kept his name. Before the railway arrived, there was no town here. Farms and homesteads were scattered across the surrounding district, but there was no urban center, no main street, no station, and no real reason for a settlement to form at this exact spot. And that changed in 1907. As the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway pushed west, it needed divisional points. Places where locomotives could be serviced, crews could be changed, repairs carried out, all to keep the system moving efficiently, and this place was selected for that role. Once the decision was made, everything else followed. The rails came first, then the buildings. People, they arrived last. This wasn't a town that grew outward from agriculture. It existed because the railway required it to exist. Construction moved quickly. Even before the rail line was fully complete, businesses began to appear. hardware stores, lumber yards, general stores, and boarding houses, built not for the population that already existed, but for the ones that were on their way. In December of 1908, the settlement was incorporated as a village. Less than a year later, on November 1st, 1909, it became a town. That pace of growth was exceptional, even for Prairie standards. Now the population numbers make that pretty clear. In 1907, this place effectively did not exist as a town. By 1911, just 4 years later, the population had reached 1,816 souls. From the very beginning, the railway shaped everything. Railway workers formed the backbone of the local economy. Agriculture, it mattered, but it followed the railway rather than leading it. That distinction shaped how Melville was built. Industrial areas and commercial buildings formed close to the rails. Housing spread outward. This wasn't a town that was designed for its looks. It was designed for a function. Everything pointed back to the railway. Hotels built in these prairie towns weren't for holiday travelers. They were essential to town survival. They would house the railway crews between their runs, commercial travelers moving through the region, and newcomers waiting for permanent housing. By the time town was taking shape, 3 hotels were already operating along Main Street: the Commercial Hotel, the Waverley Hotel, and the Windsor. All 3 served pretty much the same purpose. They weren't built for tourism or leisure. They existed to support a railway town, providing short-term lodging, meals, and services for the workforce that was consistently arriving, departing, and rotating through. In that sense, these hotels weren't just buildings on Main Street. They were part of town's operating infrastructure, as essential as the yards, the shops, and the station itself. The town continued to grow. By 1921, the population had passed 3,000 people. By 1931, it had reached almost 4,000. For a prairie town, that kind of sustained growth reflected stability rather than speculation. Melville wasn't expanding by chance. It was growing because the railway needed a permanent workforce, and because people followed reliable employment. What is often overlooked is how much of Melville's early development was driven directly by the railway and its investment. By the 1920s, the railway had poured millions of dollars into facilities here: yards, car shops, roundhouses, trackage, and water infrastructure. For a town of its size, that level of outside investment, well, it was enormous. In practical terms, the railway wasn't just the largest employer here, it was the largest builder. Even town's water system reflects that priority. The large dam constructed west of town in the early 1920s existed primarily to supply steam locomotives with water. The town benefited from it, but the railway came first. That detail explains a lot about how town could sustain such an intense rail operation so early in its life, and why its infrastructure often seemed oversized for its population. Then came the 1930s. The Depression, it reached Melville as it did all towns across the prairie. Rail traffic slowed, and employment, it declined. At one point, senior railway offices were moved out of town, and the rail car shops were closed, later reopening but at a reduced capacity. For a community so closely tied to the rail, This could have been a disaster, but the town, it didn't collapse. Instead, the surrounding district shifted more heavily toward livestock, poultry, and dairy production as grain prices fell and yields suffered. This place adapted by becoming a service and processing center during this unstable time in its early history. In 1939, the town experienced one of the most extraordinary moments in its history. On June 3rd, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth passed through Melville during their royal tour of Canada. Town's population exploded as more than 60,000 people gathered to view the royals. What had been planned as a brief stop was extended as crowds filled the streets. Hotels were packed, cafes overflowed. The town operated at a pace it had never seen before or since. For one day, it wasn't just a railway town, it was the center of attention for the entire region. The years that followed the Second World War marked another shift. Railway employment stabilized, even as new technology gradually reduced the number of workers required. At the same time, agricultural processing expanded. Dairy and poultry industries grew, adding stability and diversification to the local economy. Population rose again. Between 1946 and 1956, it added more than 1,100 residents, pushing the population close to 5,000 people. And in 1960, Melville was officially incorporated as a city. For decades, the King George Hotel, first known as the Windsor, remained part of town's fabric. It adapted with the times through renovations, updated facilities, and changes in ownership, continuing to serve a place that had long since moved past its earliest railway years. Then, in February 2010, the building was lost in a fire. The blaze was later ruled arson, and one of the people who lived there was implicated in setting it. Hundreds gathered to watch the firefighters battle the flames of the landmark that had stood in their city for over a century. For the town, the loss wasn't just structural. Hotels like this carry function and routine, places shaped by work, travel, conversation, and daily life, accumulating history over generations. And when they're gone, something practical disappears with them. Trains still run through here, not the steam engines of old, but modern diesel locomotives pulling long lines of freight cars. The tracks are still doing what they were built to do, it's just that everything else has changed. The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway Station was built in 1908, back when town itself was just starting to take shape around it. It no longer serves passengers the way it once did, and many of its original purposes have faded or shifted elsewhere over the years. Via Rail continues to serve the line, operating today from a small modern shelter beside the tracks. It's a simpler arrangement, reflective of how rail travel works in the present, keeping this place connected to points far beyond the Prairie. Melville exists because of decisions made far from here, in railway offices, boardrooms, and places most residents never saw. It carries a name connected to the Titanic. It grew faster than almost anyone expected, and it adapted when circumstances changed. Melville was founded in 1907 as a major hub for the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. While the rival Canadian Northern also had presence in the area, both lines were eventually consolidated into the government-owned Canadian National in 1923, uniting Melville's rail history under one banner. There was once a myth about the Canadian prairies, one that nearly strangled the future of the West long before the first rail was ever laid. In 1857, Captain John Palliser looked at this exact stretch of land south of what would become Regina. He wrote it off forever. He called it the Great American Desert. He described it as the Dry Belt, a place where no civilized man could or should ever try and farm. For decades, that label stuck. It was a keep-out sign written in the official history books of the British Empire. Yet, thankfully, there was another voice that changed everything. In 1882, John McCune looked at the same soil and saw a fertile plain. He argued that the Dry Belt was an illusion, a temporary state of nature that could be conquered with grit. His report was a massive gamble, and it was the primary reason that the Canadian Pacific Railway chose this route instead of heading further north. The railway was betting the entire future of the West on McCune being right and Palliser being wrong. In 1893, the steel finally arrived to settle the argument. The Soo Line pushed through the tall grass, but it wasn't here to build a community. This was an international shortcut, a high-speed link meant to move freight and passengers from Chicago to the Pacific. The line didn't care about the dry belt or the potential of the soil. It just needed to get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. Steam engines? Well, they were very demanding. A 19th century locomotive was a thirsty beast. They could not travel hundreds of miles across the barren plain without a drink. Every dozen miles or so, the railway had to build a stop, not because there were passengers waiting, but because the machines that ran on steam needed water. And that was the birth of Milestone. By 1893, the rail dropped a station house right in the middle of the desert. It wasn't a town, it was a watering hole, a mechanical coordinate on a map. For nearly 6 years, nothing followed, no town rose up, and no streets were surveyed. If you were a passenger on those early trains, you looked out into the vast, terrifying silence. You saw a lone station house, a water tank, and a horizon that never ended. Yes, steam engines made stops here necessary, but in the meantime, the land captivated the men who worked here. For those first 6 years, the only people in Milestone was the human pit crew of the railway, known as the section gangs. Now, the CPR, it divided the line into sections. Each section needed a crew of 6 to 10 men to keep the tracks level and the bolts tight against the heavy prairie frost. These men, like Ole Sandquist, Alfred Carlson, and the Rooney brothers, lived in total isolation. They resided in the station house, which served as their bunkhouse, their dining hall, and their shield against the elements. In 1895, the station house saw its first sign of permanent life. H. Bergsteinson, a section foreman, he brought his wife. That August, their son Baldine was born, the first child of Milestone. But it was the arrival of the Carlson family in 1896 that changed the soul of the stop. Her home became a halfway house, the only place for 30 miles where a traveler could find a hot meal or a floor to sleep on. She became a mother to every bachelor homesteader and railway worker in the district. Even the hobos riding the freight train knew her kitchen door was never locked. When the station became overcrowded, she simply made more room on the floor. It was a place where privacy did not exist, but hope did. By 1898, some of the section men decided to bet their futures on the soil. John and Thomas Barmby filed the first homestead entries in the fall of that year. They worked the CPR by day, and in the evenings under the fading prairie light, they hitched up a team of oxen. This wasn't gardening, it was combat. The sod was a thick, ancient mat of roots that had never been turned. When the plow cut through, it didn't slice, it popped and snapped like pistol fire. The mosquitoes were so thick it took 3 men just to manage the team, one to steer, one to clear the plow, and one just to swat the clouds of insects away from the animals' eyes. Settlers like Robert Anderson and William Reed arrived from the east, bringing settlers' effects like entire rail cars packed with furniture, livestock, and seed. Soon after, John R. Bunn arrived and established a lumber yard and a coal yard near the tracks. John turned out to be a one-man economy. He was the first implement agent, the first justice of the peace, and eventually he was known as the father of the town. For the first time, the area around the station house felt active. You could now hear the voices, the animals, and the wagons moving across the open ground. What had once been a desert was now starting to look more like a community. The spring of 1900 was supposed to be the Great Awakening, but nature seemed determined to prove Captain Palliser right. The winter had brought no snow, the spring brought no rain, and to make matters worse, a massive prairie fire that previous fall had stripped the grass for miles, leaving the land black, naked, and parched. And to make matters worse, by midsummer the Moose Jaw Creek, the only source of running surface water for the area, well, it had turned into a bed of mud. Farmers even dug shallow wells into the creek bed, praying for a seep of moisture to keep their horses and cattle alive. It was said that farmers during the drought could expect to spend 1/3 of their day just hauling water in barrels to support their lives. The math of survival was brutal. An 8-horse team spent its day hitched to a water wagon instead of a plow. The heat was relentless. Doubt started to settle, deeper than the dust. People looked at the station house and wondered if they should just load their belongings back onto the train and head east. On August 9th, the rain came. It wasn't just a shower, it was a soaker. It came too late to save the crops that year, but it saved the spirit of the settlement. Somehow through the drought, the land yielded 10 bushels an acre. Yet while the harvest provided hope, the drought had left them with a grim reality. They had no feed for their animals. And winter was right around the corner, and there's nothing colder than a prairie winter. To survive, the settlers had to form a cooperative. They traveled 30 miles southwest to a hay marsh near Charles Kessler's ranch. They spent the summer putting up tons of hay and the entire winter hauling it back through blinding blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. The following year, 1901, brought abundant moisture, but it also brought a new enemy, wireworms. In the new land, these pests were a nightmare, cutting the wheat yield by 50%. Yet the community refused to quit. That fall, every farmer had a little wheat to thresh. In a true act of modern pioneer cooperation, the entire district was served by a single second-hand Sawyer-Massey separator and a portable engine owned by the Ross brothers and William Bradley. They didn't make a profit. They barely collected enough to pay their help, but they ensured that every neighbor's crop was processed. The first rail car of wheat ever shipped from Milestone was a shared car, meaning it took the entire community to fill it. At the time, there was no elevator yet, so they built a temporary platform out of railway ties, lifted 240-pound sacks of grain by hand, and emptied them into the boxcar. It was number 1 hard red fife, sold for 65 cents a bushel. It was the first proof of work the world saw from the Milestone district. By 1902, word of the Canadian Prairie's fertile soil reached the American Midwest. There you could expect to pay $100 an acre. Here in Milestone, it was selling for just $8. Next came the speculators. Firms like Harry Hopper and Luce and Jones bought 200,000-acre blocks to divide and sell to the American farmers. They soon organized excursion trains for the farmers who came from the Midwest, funneling them toward the Canadian border. These new arrivals transformed the quiet stop at Milestone into a booming town site. To many, it seemed like town went up overnight. To handle the rush, the hotel was built like a barracks, packing 75 men a night into rows of double bunks. Milestone was beginning to grow. It was during this boom that Bernard Larson arrived from the Dakotas, bringing a secret weapon, flax. He taught the Canadian farmers that flax was the most valuable first crop they could raise on heavy clay land. By 1906, the Milestone district led the entire province in production. On August 15th of that year, the watering hole for locomotives officially became a town, complete with a weekly newspaper and a brass band. But the struggle didn't end with incorporation. The winter of 1906 was an exceptionally severe winter, starting with a 3-day blizzard that piled snowbanks 10 feet high. During that period, the coal shortage was the worst the Sioux Line had ever known, and many farmers struggled trying to keep their families warm. It was a long, cold winter. So, you may ask yourself, why does Milestone matter? Because it's the place that worked when everyone said it wouldn't. It was built by people like the Carlsons, who turned a mechanical station house into a kitchen, and men like John Bunn, who wore every hat from land agent to mayor, and of course many others. They'd all do anything to keep the dream alive. The idea that this is nothing more than a prairie desert is now buried under millions of bushels of grain. Looking at this town today, you are looking at an act of will. You are looking at a community that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the harshest winters on the planet. This town wasn't an accident. It was a reminder that the land is only as dry as the spirit of the people who walk it, and in Milestone, they were always prairie proud. By the early 1900s, before there was a place known as Radville, there was a settlement that was already developing a few miles north. It was known as Wallendale, a small service center to that part of the district, little more than a post office and a handful of buildings to the open prairie. But Wallendale wasn't Radville. When the railway came through, the center of activity began to shift south towards the line. Buildings were hauled in from up to 4 miles from the north, including that post office, and a new town site started to take shape along the tracks. What had once been scattered across the land began to gather here, and with that, a new name was to be chosen. At first, the name Conrad was proposed, recognizing Conrad Paquin, whose farm once occupied this site. However, that name had already been used, so it was changed. Rad was taken from Conrad and combined with the French word ville, meaning town, and so the name Radville appeared. Now, to understand Radville, you have to understand the desperation that preceded it. By 1904, the last Best West was in full swing. Pioneers were pouring into Saskatchewan from France, Quebec, Britain, and the United States. They would arrive at the railway platform in Weyburn, the end of the world at the time, get off the train, and simply stare into the distance. The station's platform was a chaotic mess, piles of furniture, suitcases, crates of chickens, and families who didn't speak the same language, but they shared that same look in their eyes. From Weyburn, they pushed south and west. Those with money had horses, the rest had oxen, and the truly desperate walked. They were heading into a wilderness that offered no guarantees of survival. There is a story that perfectly captures the confusion of those early days. There was a young immigrant who did not fully understand the rules of the British Empire. He soon found a piece of land that he liked. He noticed the iron survey peg in the corner and figured that was his receipt. He pulled it out of the ground, built a small cairn of stones, and left a note saying, "Me Homestead." He carried that heavy iron peg all the way back to the land office in Weyburn, slammed it on the desk with $10, and waited for his deed. Well, the agent didn't give him a deed. He gave him a $30 fine for tampering with a survey marker, because out here the law was unforgiving as a prairie winter. By 1910, almost every acre of land between Radville and the U.S. border had been filed for. However, filing and staying were two different things. To keep the title, you had to build a home and break a portion of the land, turning raw prairie into something productive. Not everyone was successful. Some did fail. So now we have a glimpse of how this place began and how it received its name. When the railway reached this stretch of the prairie, growth wasn't gradual, it was immediate. In 1910, the first businesses appeared almost overnight. They weren't built so much as they were positioned. Wooden buildings were dragged in on stone skids from the north and set down along a rough strip of ground beside the tracks. No foundation, no permanence, just placement. This wasn't a town being planned, it was a town assembling itself. By early 1911, this place had structure. Radville was officially incorporated on January 3rd, and the first council met inside Charlie Hill's hardware store. There were no speeches about the future, no grand vision of what this place might become. Actually, the first order of business was simple: to shut down Saudy's pool room by 10:30 p.m. You see, they weren't thinking decades ahead. They were dealing with what was right in front of them at the time. Things like fire protection, health concerns, and the landscape that didn't give much back. It was a place trying to make something grow where it didn't want to. The wind stripped it, the soil fought it. So they came up with policies like plant a tree, keep it alive, and they'd pay you 50 cents a tree. Everything here was practical. Everything was immediate. Because what had been given a name was already turning into something much larger than a town. It was to become a machine. Then came the decision that would define the physical grit of the town. The original town site was on the north side of the tracks. The water there was good, clear, sweet, and plentiful. But the drainage was a nightmare. When it rained, the heavy gumbo soil turned into a thick black mess that could stop a team of horses in their tracks. So the town leaders looked to the south side where the ground was higher. The drainage was better. It actually looked like a place where a modern town should stand. The problem, the water on the south side was alkali. It was bitter, mineral heavy, and hard on the stomach. But they had to make a choice. They chose the dry ground over the good water and moved the buildings across the tracks. They relocated the stores and the banks to the south side, facing each other across a grass strip that would later become Main Street. They made a decision that would shape daily life for decades. It was a trade-off of survival over comfort, the quintessential pioneer bargain. There were speeches about Radville becoming the most important divisional point on the Brandon-Lethbridge line. And for a time, it wasn't just talk, it was happening. By 1912, a proper station was built. And that same year, a roundhouse was constructed, a 10-stall brick structure with machine shops running day and night. By 1915, this place had changed completely. What had once been open prairie was now a working railway center, loud, busy, and alive. 45 men worked the shops in 8-hour shifts, as the whistle became the clock for the entire district. It told the farmers when it was noon and the children when it was time to go home. This was the era of the railway men. This was a time when engineers were notorious, like frosty winters and dusty roads. They were known across the line. And at its peak, 18 crews and 24 engines operated from here. Town reflected this expansion. Stores filled out Main Street, goods came in, and money moved rapidly through this place. John Eby's 2-story store carried everything a growing town could need. Charlie Hill was now selling Fords for $900, and Pickett's and Sherman's Hardware had become an Oldsmobile agency. For a while, everything pointed in one direction. Radville wasn't just a place, it was a functioning organ on the rail. Even at the height of the boom, the Prairie reminded them of their fragility. In the fall of 1918, the Spanish flu had arrived, and it didn't care about the railway's schedule. It swept through the district with little warning. In some homes, entire family members were stricken at once, and sometimes help didn't always arrive in time. Local doctors drove for days without sleep, moving from one isolated homestead to the next, doing what they could. It was a quiet, grim period that stripped away the optimism of the early 1900s. It was the first real sign that the modern prairie dream carried a cost. Then the 1930s hit. You see, in the 1920s, farmers were buying modern tractors and stoves. In the 1930s, they were burning their furniture for heat. The numbers are quite staggering. In 1929, wheat was $1.40 a bushel. By 1932, it had collapsed to 18 cents. You could sell a prime 1,000-pound steer and only get $10 for it, hardly enough to cover the cost of raising it. The land itself seemed to be rebelling as the drought lasted for years. Then came the grasshoppers, and by 1937 there was no grain for the livestock. Farmers cut thistle, a bitter, prickly weed, just to give their cattle something to chew on. Town council was overwhelmed. People began to leave, loading what few possessions they had into their vehicles, and started heading north. The Radville machine was being left behind. It was estimated that the 1930s set the district back 15 years. Through it all, the railway was the only thing that kept this town on the map. It was the only way food and fuel got in. Without it, Radville would have become a ghost town by 1935. The Prairie? Well, it wasn't done yet. In February 1947, a blizzard hit that redefined the word obstruction. The wind packed the snow into drifts as hard as concrete. Every line in and out of Radville was blocked. The railway sent a double header, 2 engines and a snowplow to clear the line. It got stuck. They sent another double header to rescue it. That too got stuck. 4 massive steam engines, 2 snowplows, and 2 cabooses were completely buried by the snow. You couldn't even see the smokestacks. It took until April to dig them out. For 2 months, this rail town was cut off from the world. By the late 1950s, the world had changed again. But this time it wasn't nature, it was engineering. The steam engine, that majestic locomotive that whistled into the night, was being replaced by diesel. To the accountants in Winnipeg, the diesel was efficient. To Radville, the diesel was a death sentence. These newer machines didn't require a massive amount of maintenance. They didn't need a 10-stall roundhouse every few hundred miles. They didn't need the same amount of crews. In 1959, the passenger service was gutted. The mixed trains were cancelled. And then, the roundhouse, the heart, the engine, the reason for Radville's existence, closed its doors. The 18 crews were reduced to 1, and the sound of big hammers and the shift whistle fell silent. What to do with the roundhouse? Well, the people of Radville had an idea. They turned it into something practical. They stripped it out and turned it into a storage bin for wheat. The building that was designed to maintain the machines of motion was repurposed to hold the product of their soil. Radville is still here. It still has its treed streets, its hospital, and its neat lines of houses. And the railway station still stands, quiet now, but unchanged, in its place at the foot of Main Street. It's a different kind of town now. It's no longer a machine. It's a community. The big 2800 series engines may be ghosts, but the town remains a testament to what happens when you build something on a foundation of endurance. The railway might have built this town, but it's the people here that have made it last. "80 years before the title A New Hope appeared in a cinema crawl, the name New Hope already identified a 1901 post office on a desolate patch of Saskatchewan dirt. Located on Section 4, Township 9, Range 8, New Hope wasn't a movie theme. It was a survival tactic. These pioneers were adventurous, stubborn, and betting their lives on a future that had not yet arrived. This is the history of how New Hope became Stoughton. In 1901, survival on the southern Saskatchewan prairie depended less on optimism and more on geography, timing, and endurance. There was no town here, no Stoughton, only surveyed land stretching outward in every direction. However, a little over a mile away, it was here that a small group of settlers chose to stop and begin again. Men like Robert Tully and Malcolm Orr were not wandering blindly. They had studied the land, judged the soil, and made a deliberate decision to settle in a place they believed could sustain them. They called it New Hope, a name suggested by Mrs. David Donnelly, one of the first women in the district. The name carried a sense of possibility, but the conditions on the ground were far more uncertain than the name implied. So there was no guarantee a railway would ever reach them, meaning no established supply lines, and no nearby town to rely on in difficult moments. What they had instead was distance, and the understanding that if something went wrong, help would be slow, if it came at all. On December 1st, 1901, William Carefoot established the first post office in a small building on his land, creating a fragile but essential link to the outside world. Mail did not arrive on a schedule that could be trusted. It had to be brought in across the open prairie, often by a young Stan Donnelly, who rode through the coulees and unpredictable weather towards Arcola and the smaller post points along the way. Sometimes he returned with letters or supplies, and other times he was sent for something more urgent, like a doctor, making trips that were as necessary as they were uncertain. The realities of life in New Hope are best understood through moments that seem small on the surface but reveal the structure of the place. In the fall of 1903, Walter Mustard was returning from Brandon after undergoing surgery when his train became stuck in a snowdrift. Now, despite his condition, the conductor ordered every man off the train to shovel, and Walter, still recovering, worked for an hour in the cold to clear the tracks. Months later, he received payment from the railway in the form of a 30-cent check. Now, when he attempted to cash the check, a local merchant offered to take 25 cents as a fee, leaving almost nothing in return. Rather than accept that, Walter sold the check to Stan Donnelly for a quarter, choosing immediate coins over principal. And that was the economy of New Hope. Labor was constant, and returns were minimal. Word had it that in 1903 the railway was finally coming through the district. But no one knew exactly where the tracks would be laid, and out here, that one detail would decide where the town would take shape. The Canadian Pacific Railway had begun grading a line between Regina and Arcola, and for the settlers of New Hope, this should have confirmed that their gamble had paid off. But instead, it forced yet another decision. When the surveyors finalized their route, the line did not pass through New Hope. It missed the settlement by roughly 1.5 miles, placing the siding and station to the south. To the railway, the distance was insignificant, but on the prairie, it meant everything, because a town without direct access to the line was effectively cut off from growth, trade, and long-term survival. This was a point at which many early settlements simply disappeared, but New Hope did not follow that pattern. The people there did not abandon what they had built, nor did they wait for the railway to adjust its course. Instead, they made a practical decision based on the reality in front of them. If the line determined the future, then they would reposition themselves to meet it. In July of 1904, the community began the process of moving, not by leaving, but by physically relocating the town itself. Buildings were lifted from their foundations, set onto heavy timber skids, and slowly pulled across the prairie. Carefoot's post office, Mike Breyer's general store, and W.J. Wallace's shop were not replaced with new construction. They were the same structures, just dragged over 1 mile on the open prairie. The work required coordination, strength, and time. Large teams of horses and oxen provided the pulling power, while men guided each structure across the uneven terrain without the benefit of roads or a prepared route. It was not a single movement, but a sustained effort that reshaped the settlement piece by piece. And by the time it was finished, New Hope no longer existed in its original location. In its new place, at the rail siding, a new community had taken form, and with it came a new name, Stoughton. The origin of the name was never fully agreed upon. Some claim it came from a Canadian Pacific Railway dispatcher in Montreal, while others believe it came from a conductor on his first train ride through the area. Regardless of which version was correct, the change reflected a broader reality. The identity chosen by the settlers has been replaced by one tied directly to the railway and now defined their future. On February 26, 1904, the village of Stoughton was officially proclaimed. The gamble made in 1901 had paid off. Once the railway was in place, the village was finally connected to the outside world. But instead of bringing stability, it brought a new set of pressures. Growth, industry, and outside influence all came at once, and the settlement had to adjust quickly. On February 1st, 1905, the town faced its first major test when the King Edward Hotel, one of the most prominent buildings in the new village, caught fire. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and under those conditions there was little that could be done to stop it. Within an hour, the structure had been reduced to a burned-out frame. Those inside escaped as best they could, many of them with little more than what they were wearing, stepping directly into the cold night to avoid the flames. In the middle of the urgency, Dr. Robertson, who had been staying in the hotel, took the time to get fully dressed, including his tie, before making his exit through a window into the snow. It was a small detail, but one that reflected a certain composure that had already become part of life in the settlement. The fire did not slow the development of the town. If anything, it marked the transition from temporary structures to something more permanent. By 1906, the original boxcar station had been replaced by a proper depot, signaling the railway's presence had been established. At 11:20 in the morning that same year, on June 18th, the first train from Regina to Brandon arrived at the village. It remained at the station for exactly 4 minutes before continuing on its way. In that brief stop, the role of town became quite clear. It was no longer an isolated cluster of buildings, but now it was part of a larger system that moved across the prairie. From here towards Regina ran what was widely believed to be the longest straight stretch of railway track in the world, extending for nearly 88 miles without a curve. Now, the land itself made this possible, lying flat as part of an ancient glacial lake bed that allowed the track to be laid without deviation. The people who first settled at New Hope chose the land and began building a community, and when the railway did not come to them, they moved everything to meet it. By 1906, that effort had taken hold. The settlement was no longer temporary or uncertain. It stood where it needed to be, not where it began, but where it could last. And that's the story how New Hope moved and became Stoughton. Today, the rail grade still cuts across the prairie, but the steel rails are gone. The elevator that once dominated the skyline stands silent, and only a handful of residents remain where freight cars and passenger trains once moved in a steady rhythmic pulse. The place that would become Truax began as a simple survey point on the Dominion land grid, the southeast quarter of Section 16, Township 11, Range 22, west of the 2nd Meridian. The Canadian Northern Railway built a line connecting Radville and Moose Jaw, and along that line, a siding appeared at Truax. In 1912, a station was constructed here, built according to the Canadian Northern Plan 100-29S36. The station handled passengers, freight, and mail. It also served as the communications hub of the district. Through telegraph lines running along the railway, this quiet stretch of the prairie was suddenly connected to the rest of Saskatchewan and to the wider world beyond. Before elevators existed, grain often had to be shoveled by hand directly into the boxcars to avoid expensive handling charges. So with the railway in place, this small town began to form around the tracks. And soon after, the first grain elevator was built in 1912 by the Will Grant Grain Company. For farmers in the district, this structure quickly became the most important building in the community. A second elevator followed in 1913, built by the Topper Grain Company. Then, in 1915, the Cooperative Elevator Company constructed a third. With 3 elevators standing along the siding, Truax had finally established itself as a major grain shipping point. The harvests that filled these beasts were brought in by steam outfits, large threshing crews that traveled from farm to farm each autumn. A single outfit could require 15 to 20 men, working long days beside the roaring steam engine and separator. While the men worked in the fields, the women of the neighboring farms helped each other prepare enormous meals, often the only time in the year that they had a chance to gather and visit together. Around the station and elevators, a lively community developed. One of the most familiar figures in the area was Tom Newman. Newman operated town's livery barn and served as the district's drayman. He was the man responsible for hauling goods from the railway station to local businesses. When the train arrived, Newman would load his wagon or sleigh high with freight, mail, groceries, hardware, and supplies destined for town stores. And if there was space left on the dray, local children were quick to climb aboard for a ride. Newman would also deliver water throughout the community. He filled a tank at a well a mile southwest of town and delivered it door to door. His horses knew the route so well that they often stopped at the correct houses without instruction. Local stories even claimed that the team could make their own rounds on their own. Saturdays were the busiest day of the week. Farm families came to town to collect their mail, buy supplies, and visit their neighbors. During the winter, many arrived early in the afternoon so they could return home before it got dark. When the livery barn was full, dozens of teams were tied up behind the lumberyard. turning this quiet settlement into a very busy gathering place filled with the sound of horses and conversation. One of the most remembered events in the district was a sudden March blizzard during the early settlement years. The day had begun mild, and much of the snow had already melted. Cattle wandered freely across the open prairie, but during the night, a storm arrived. By morning, deep drifts had formed along the railway line. Many cattle had drifted with the wind until they piled up underneath the railway bridge, where they were later found frozen beneath the snow. And at least one man also lost his life in that same storm, found only 100 yards from his own home. During storms like this, pioneers often tied ropes from their houses to their barns. Without them, it was easy to lose direction in a whiteout. Before the land was fully cultivated, mosquitoes were a constant torment. When farmers broke the native prairie sod, they often lit smudge fires at each end of the field using damp straw or green wood. As teams of horses approached the smoke, they would often break into a trot, desperate for a moment's relief from the insects. The oxen were particularly difficult to control. Driven mad by mosquitoes, they sometimes bolted straight into nearby sloughs. They'd lay down in the water, harness and all. Getting them out and back to work could sometimes take hours. These were just some of the daily frustrations that tested the endurance of settlers who farmed this district. The 1930s brought a challenge of a different magnitude. It was the era that became known as the Hungry 30s or Dirty 30s, years defined by drought, dust, and the total failure of crops. Fields that sprouted green in the spring, often withered by early summer due to the lack of rain, and government relief sometimes arrived in the form of a few bales of straw or spoiled hay. In desperate years, farmers even cut and cured Russian thistle to feed their livestock. One of the most unusual incidents remembered in the district involved an infestation of armyworms that were so thick that it briefly stopped a train. At one particular school in the district, children gathered along the rail grade to watch the spectacle unfold. The worms were moving across the prairie in enormous numbers, creeping over fields and roads in a slow, relentless wave. As the wave reached the rail line, the worms didn't stop. They climbed straight over the steel, quickly burying the tracks beneath a moving carpet of insects. When the train reached this section, the locomotive slowed to a crawl before grinding to a complete halt. Every time the engineer tried to pull forward, the massive driving wheel simply spun in place, slipping on the slick, greasy remains of all the crushed insects. For hours, the train sat stranded while railway workers and local residents cleared the track. Only after the rails were scraped clean could the locomotive finally pull forward again. For the children watching nearby, it was an unforgettable sight. A prairie train halted not by snow or a flood, but by an army of insects. And along with the worms, vast clouds of grasshoppers would appear on the horizon looking like dark smoke. When they descended, they stripped the fields bare in a matter of hours. They didn't stop at the crops either. They chewed through laundry on the lines, garden hoses, and even wooden handles on pitchforks, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. Yet through all the trials of the Depression, the grain trade remained the backbone of the community. In 1958, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool built a new elevator with a large annex, replacing an older structure. On the morning of August 7, 1964, disaster struck. In a cruel twist of timing, the Wheat Pool elevator was consumed by fire and burned to the ground. Only 24 hours earlier, crews had just finished demolition on the original 1915 pool elevator that stood right beside it. Suddenly, town's horizon went blank. For the first time in over 50 years, the community had no elevator at all. Cleanup began immediately. By November of the same year, a replacement had already been completed. The grain, once again, began moving through the town. Over time, the patterns of prairie life changed. Farms grew larger. Fewer families were needed to work the land. Passenger rail service disappeared in the late 1950s. The station itself, well, it was moved away in 1976. And the rail section house was burned by the company in 1977. So now we stand back and we look at this place and call it a ghost town. But to do that is to miss the deeper story. There's a sequence that built this place: the rhythmic strike of a surveyor's stake, the rise of a homestead, the steel of the railway, and the height of an elevator. This was the same pulse that shaped the history of the prairies. Ah yes, the tracks may be gone, but the line they carved across the land remains. And the elevator may stand silent, but the harvests it handled once helped feed the world. When the dates are placed in order, when the stories are remembered, Truax stops being just a fading point on the map. It becomes something else. It becomes a monument to people who came here, broke the sod, endured the storms, and built a community where none had existed before. And long after the rails have rusted away, their story remains written across the prairie itself. Hey, my name is Mike. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you found some value in this video, please give a like and consider subscribing. And if you're a new subscriber, let me know in the comments below. My mission here with this channel is to build a digital archive and preserve our prairie history before it's gone. And I can't do it without this community. To all the subscribers and members already supporting this mission, thank you for helping me keep these stories alive. Until next time, keep your wheels on the rails and I'll see you down the tracks.